All right, let's get started. Welcome again. I'm Maureen Meyer, Vice President for Programs here at WOLA. Before we get started, a quick housekeeping. The conversation will be in Spanish and English. So if you need interpretation, please go to the interpretation button at the bottom and either select English or Spanish. If you want to hear the language, both of them, just stay on this channel and you will get both English and Spanish. Entonces, para las personas que necesitan interpretación, si van al botón al lado abajo, al lado derecho de interpretación, seleccionan español e inglés. Si no, toda la discusión será, si se deja sin escoger, serían inglés y español durante la conversación. So I'm very happy to welcome our panelists for this discussion. First, I just wanted to give some quick comments about the documentary, and then I'll present the panelists for this discussion. I'm happy to have seen the vertical wall. I think it provides an important overview of the many aspects of migration and people seeking protection from, in this case, looking at the origins of violence in Central America to the US role in fueling that violence, which I think is often forgotten in terms of in part by deporting former gang members back to these countries with very weak institutions and in the post-conflict era, to discussions about US border security and immigration enforcement policies that are focused on walls, deportations, deterrence, and how these are being replicated by Mexico and other countries in the region. I think it's important that the documentary examines the role of countries like Mexico, which is both a transit and growing destination country for migrants and asylum seekers, the risks that they face as on their journey, as well as the different organizations and migrant shelters that are working to support them and defend their rights. And I also found the focus of the work of HABESHA refreshing, as I think it's focused on an organization, and we can hear more about it today, that is working to provide educational opportunities for refugees in Mexico, and more just what is the role of receiving communities and how they can support refugees as they move forward with their lives. So I'm very much looking forward to talking to Sonja and Maxime about their work on the documentary, as well as David and Stephanie, to put this documentary into the broader perspective of the regional flow of migrants and refugees. So just briefly, and we're gonna kind of start with a round of comments, perceptions from the panelists. And then if you have questions you'd like to ask them, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom. You can find the Q&A tab. And then we'll go to another round of discussion with them. So we are joined by Sonja Wolf, who has a PhD in international politics from the Aberystwyth, I'm not going to pretend to pronounce that, university in UK, and is assistant professor with the drug policy program at the Center for Economic Research and Teaching in Mexico. Her research is focused on violence, security, migration, especially Mexico and Central America. Maxime Pluvinet is from Toulon, France. He holds a master's in international relations from Sciences Po Toulouse, and he joined HABESHA in 2019 as content creation officer. And you can talk about the work that he's done on this documentary as well as past ones. He is also a journalist with the Lebanese digital media, Ixi Beyrouth. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that well. David FitzGerald is a Theodore E. Gildred Chair at the U.S.-Mexico Relations, Professor of Sociology, and the co-director for the Center of Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. His research analyzes policies regulating migration and refugee in countries of origin, transit, and destination, as well as the experiences of people on the move. And we're joined by my colleague, Stephanie Brewer, who is the director for Mexico and migrant rights here at WOLA, has over a decade of experience working on migration and human rights issues, more recently at WOLA and previously at Centro Pro in Mexico City. So welcome all of you. Why don't we start off with you, Sonja and Maxime, on the documentary and how this came about.
Thank you, Maureen. So the documentary is a collaboration between the CIDE's drug policy program and HABESHA Media. And so at the beginning, we thought that Maxime and I could talk a little bit about why we wanted to do this documentary and how we did it. I suppose the documentary for us is a means really to have a conversation about forced migration, but it's especially a conversation we would like to have, perhaps not so much with policymakers, but with citizens who live in the countries that we show in the documentary. But also we shouldn't forget that even though the documentary focuses perhaps on a more specific example, which is Central Americans heading to Mexico and the United States, forced migration is really a global issue. So I think this is a film that really can speak to people also outside the Latin American region. And in terms of forced migration, perhaps what I would like to highlight is that when we talk about migration more broadly, we can see many labels that are being used also for different purposes. And so people will be familiar with concepts such as refugees and asylum seekers. They're also internally displaced persons, and more broadly migrants. But perhaps what I would like to emphasize in this first round of comments is that these labels can serve to manage migration, but they can also feed into states' political agendas. So in that sense, they serve to divide the migrant population, perhaps divided into people on the move who are seen as more deserving or as less deserving. And so we wanted to get away a little bit from these narrow concepts and talk about forced migration, because as you will have seen in the documentary, people leave Central America, or at least the three countries that we were trying to look at more closely, for very different reasons. And perhaps when you look at El Salvador, what comes to mind is gang violence, especially. And when we look at Honduras, by contrast, we see that many people are leaving also because of gang violence, but from the countryside, people are leaving due to food insecurity in many cases. And so forced migration really is perhaps a more useful term to look more broadly at why people feel compelled to leave their countries. And so it's a way to get away from perhaps a narrow idea that people are refugees or asylum seekers if they flee physical violence, and that those who are perceived as economic migrants or as voluntary migrants are therefore less deserving of aid or protection. So this is the main point. One of the main points in the documentary, and also a point that I wanted to put out there for the discussion. And the second one has to do with migration deterrence, especially the term that is also the title of the film, the vertical border. So we see in the case of Mexico how this vertical border operates, and even though the film focuses on Mexico, what we're hoping to show in the film is that what is really behind this vertical border is an interest by the United States to operationalize this vertical border. So this is, even though we see how this vertical border operates in Mexico through migration practices, also through drug war violence, it is really a way for the United States to externalize or to push out its border further and further, not just into Mexico, but also into northern Central America. And this is being done, as we have seen, in order to prevent migrants who are seeking sanctuary from reaching the territory of the United States. I think this is perhaps relevant when we look at the vertical border in combination with the root causes. So if we remember that the idea of addressing the root causes has been important for the Biden administration. And so perhaps it is striking to see how, on the one hand, we have this rhetoric by the Biden administration that has stated that it wants to tackle corruption and impunity, for example, in Central America, that it wants to invest in jobs and development so that people can stay at home. But at the same time, we see that the Biden administration is also continuing policies and programs that were instituted by the Trump administration, for example. So perhaps one way to think about this is how important are really human rights when we look at the responses to migration, how important are political and electoral considerations when we try to understand states' responses to migration. And so perhaps I will just finish with one more thought about the Biden administration. Perhaps the risk that we might see is that if migration deterrence, the idea that people should kept out of a certain jurisdiction is the priority, is the United States then prepared to turn a blind eye to what is actually happening in the countries of origin, for example, in terms of criminal violence and corruption, in return for getting migration deterrence from those countries. And this is a point that is also relevant for Mexico, where one of the greatest concerns at the moment is, of course, the deepening of the militarization process that began over a decade ago, but that is being continued by the current president, and really has expanded in the sense that military officers are taking command positions in civilian institutions such as the Mexican Migration Institute, and generally really are participating much more heavily in public life than was the case before. So really, as Maureen said, the documentary really includes many issues. I hope we were able at least to touch at them and to provide you with a solid overview of what is happening in Central America, but also how Mexico and the United States are responding to this forced migration. So I will stop here and hand over to Maxime, who can explain a little how we were trying to do this film.
Gracias, Sonja. Hablaré en español porque mi inglés no es tan bueno. Entonces, pues yo seré muy breve, sobre todo para dejar el espacio a las preguntas que haya quizás sobre el proceso de cómo hemos hecho este documental. Nada más enfatizar sobre dos cosas. La primera es que, como quizá lo han notado en el documental, no se ven a muchas personas migrantes, tampoco se ven mucho a espacios como retenes de migración, estaciones migratorias, o no se ven en Centroamérica muchas imágenes de los barrios con presencia de maras, ¿no? Estas faltas que hay en el documental tienen un motivo, una razón, ¿no? Es que por el poco tiempo que tuvimos en cada lugar para grabar, se complicó mucho el acceso a dicha información, y también especificar que también es parte de la estrategia de la frontera vertical, ¿no? El hecho de que espacios como los retenes, como las estaciones migratorias, son difíciles de acceso, son difíciles de grabar. Por ejemplo, en el caso de la estación migratoria de Tapachula, en Chiapas, hemos hecho el proceso para solicitar el acceso a dicho espacio y no lo hemos logrado. Y hay una razón, ¿no? Porque estos espacios están considerados como un asunto de seguridad nacional ¿no? La migración es considerada como un asunto de seguridad nacional. México lo está viendo así y es exactamente como los Estados Unidos quiere que México lo considere, ¿no? Por otra parte, otro detalle, aprovechando de tener a David aquí con nosotros, la intervención de David y de Todd Miller al final del documental permiten, pues permite enfatizar que este tema, más allá del tema de la frontera vertical en el contexto regional, ¿no? Que es el contexto latinoamericano, es un problema global, ¿no? Que este documental, La frontera vertical, hubiera podido tratar de cómo la Unión Europea trata de repeler, de disuadir la migración eh, de subsahariana o de Medio Oriente. Este documental hubiera podido ir a Libia, a Líbano, a Turquía y documentar los mismos procesos porque son estrategias globales, ¿no? De bloqueo, de disuasión, de contención. Um, y justamente esta discusión que hay al final del documental con la entrevista de David FitzGerald y Todd Miller permiten como ampliar un poco la mirada, ¿no? La perspectiva hacia una perspectiva más global, ¿no? Hasta ahora en cada presentación del documental que tuvimos se ha mencionado, hubo una pregunta sobre los refugiados ucranianos y el tratamiento un poco diferencial, ¿no? Que hay y se me hace pues muy actual, muy actual de este tema de la frontera vertical que efectivamente no solamente se ejerce en el contexto latinoamericano, sino a nivel mundial. Será todo de momento, pero quedo abierto. Bueno, tengo dos cachuchas, ¿no? Puedo contestar a las preguntas sobre cómo se ha realizado el documental por una parte, pero también soy representante de Proyecto HABESHA, de HABESHA Media, quien aparece en el documental, de hecho. Entonces, si tienen preguntas sobre estas dos cosas, pues las puedo contestar con mucho gusto.
Muchas gracias, Maxime. David, you're in the documentary. Tell us about your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. And I congratulate Sonja and Maxime and the rest of the crew for putting together this really wonderful documentary. As Maxime was suggesting, in some ways, this film could have been made in a number of different contexts, and it would have some really similar themes about the ways that the rich democracies of the global north have tried to keep asylum seekers at an arm's length where they can't even reach a territory to be able to ask for asylum. And in some ways, thinking about the particularity of the Central America, Mexico, US context, this film looks like it could have been shot 40 years ago. And I'm not just talking about the use of historical footage, I'm talking about the recurrent themes in the ways that the US has used Mexico as a kind of buffer state to bottle up Central Americans in the south of the country. The use of pushbacks at the US-Mexico border for those who were able to make it past the obstacle course. We see evidence of this also in the 1980s, not as systematic as today, but certainly precursors to these kinds of pushbacks. And then we also see some more positive things. We see the important role of NGOs in the film, particularly of Catholic NGOs. And thinking about NGOs and other civil society actors more broadly, that is where there has been a change, I think, since the 1980s. There's a much denser network of civil society now, of organizations like WOLA, which are active both in Mexico and in the US, journalism, the fact that these kinds of processes, which once were much more secret, are now becoming much more widely known and really kicked up to a higher transnational level. There's another point that I would like to make is that we see evidence of a kind of a ratchet effect in these policies, where even when the administration changes, even when we've moved from the very different Trump to Biden administrations, a lot of these policies are sticky. And we see that throughout the world, where a policy that might have been put into place by a Democratic or a left-wing or a more right-wing administration, once they're in place, they continue for a very long time. It's not that policies never change, but when we're thinking about border fortifications, we don't see any of the additions to the so-called wall being taken down. Once those are in place, we see the continuation of versions of the Title 42 pretext for using the pandemic as a way of keeping out those who would seek asylum on the southern border with Mexico, as well as the ongoing forms of pressure on Mexico, which now have a 4-decade history. So not all policies are the same between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, but especially the ones that have to do with optics of border control are really quite sticky and sometimes in surprising ways. And then the final theme that I would like to draw out of the film is of impunity. And this is from the very beginning all the way to the end of the film. We see the impunity that no one is ever really punished for the slaying of Archbishop Oscar Romero. No one is punished in the vast majority of cases for the robberies of migrants in transit, for rapes, for disappearances, for murders. That no one is held accountable. No governments are really being held accountable for the illegal pushbacks at the US-Mexico border, or the ones at the Guatemala-Mexico border, for the violations of the right to exit from Central American countries. And this is one of the more powerful, disturbing themes that come across is really this impunity. And hope springs eternal that by highlighting these processes and making them so visible and viscerally appreciable, that can be changed.
Thank you, David. Before I pass it off to you, Stephanie, just to remind folks that if you would like to pose questions to the participants, please go to the Q&A box and add them. I see there's one question. We'll get to that in a minute. But if anyone else has any others, please type it in and we will get to them in a second. So, Stephanie.
Thanks, Maureen. Well, so first of all, I, of course, want to say a big congratulations and a big thank you to Sonja, to Maxime, and to everyone on your teams who made this film. We know that it has come out looking spectacular and streamlined, but took an enormous amount of time and efforts to produce, and it's so important. So thank you so much. And thanks for thinking of us and teaming up with WOLA to make this screening possible. I think that something the documentary does extremely well is juxtapose what is one of the most brutal and can be one of the most dehumanizing contexts of human existence, which is the current reality of the dangers that are faced by people in forced migration. Juxtaposing that with voices and signs of hope and activism and the struggle to protect this population, with the participation in the documentary of course, migrants themselves and people on the move throughout the Americas, and people who are working in shelters and in organizations and fighting for migrant rights. So I found that very striking. And actually, it was interesting to hear a moment ago Maxime say that originally you had envisioned filming more footage in migrant detention stations and checkpoints and these really ubiquitous places of repression and use of force and detention. And of course, the fact that those didn't all make it in have to do with you not being able to get access. But in a way, the final product, I think, really focuses our attention where it needs to be, which is on the people who are at the center of this, the people who are forced to move and who are making the decision to move from that place of having to for their own survival. But finally, these are the people who are driving this movement, and they're the people we need to be keeping front and center when we think about what kind of policies should the US government, should the Mexican government, should governments regionally and in collaboration be implementing, looking at the heightened levels of migration and especially of forced migration in the hemisphere. The question and the quote that most stood out to me, I think, in this film, and I think it will have stood out to a lot of people who saw it, is why don't we turn the border wall into bikes? I absolutely loved that, because wherever we come down on exactly what should be our immigration policy, or exactly where we come down on the importance of bikes, that's essentially calling us to question, this inertia, which is actually more than inertia. It's this ratcheting effect, that David mentioned, but the inertia of doing more and more of the same failed thing, rather than realizing we need to fundamentally rethink these policies and some of these strategies, and that we need to be thinking of truly changing the way that migration and forced migration and asylum is being dealt with. We actually recently, Maureen and myself and another colleague here at WOLA, we've just come back from a visit to Mexico's southern border, to Tapachula, which everyone just saw in the documentary. And the very quick context on Tapachula, as you saw, this is the city where most asylum claims are currently being made in Mexico. It's come to be known as the prison city for asylum seekers, because they arrive already, of course, in this moment of having passed through an extremely dangerous, difficult journey. They're arriving, in the condition of being some of the most vulnerable folks on the planet in that moment in their lives. And they arrive to this mixture of policies that produces what I would describe as the worst of all worlds, right? So you're taking people who are already in this state of vulnerability, people who need protection, people who need support. And from the very first moment, if they try to cross into Mexico at a formal, point of entry, they're very often told that they can't seek asylum there. And so from that first moment, they're forced to try to cross somewhere else. They're risking being detained. They're risking being taken to one of those migration stations. They're risking other types of violence just to simply try to arrive to where they can make an asylum claim. And of course, once they make that claim, they'll be put into a process that right now is extremely long. It's bureaucratic. They have to be going to different Mexican government institutions. And right now, Mexico is facing essentially an explosion in the number of asylum requests. Last year, 2021, in Mexico, there were over 130,000 asylum requests. This is more than 100 times the number of requests that were made in 2013, to give you an idea. And so this means people are stranded for months and months and months in Tapachula, trying to make ends meet, often not being able to make ends meet, facing discrimination, facing abuses. What purpose is that serving? It's not serving any purpose. Certainly, our priority is the rights of that population. It's clearly not serving that purpose. But it's also not serving any kind of larger migration management purpose in the region, because as is so clearly demonstrated in the film, the very idea of forced migration, the factors of violence, of risk, and of course, increasingly other factors add in, climate change is mentioned. These factors have not been solved, unfortunately won't be solved in the near future, although we of course recognize and emphasize the importance of addressing root causes. Of course, that's what needs to be done and done well, but that's not going to solve these problems in the short term. People will be forced to move to survive. And these sorts of deterrence policies, the use of force, the use of military forces to be intercepting migrant families, this simply doesn't contribute to a good security policy in Mexico with all the security challenges it's facing. And it doesn't contribute to achieving any kind of sustainable situation where people can move in a non-dangerous way, or where people have the option to stay in their home country. All of the end states we're trying to get to, none of those are served by re-victimizing and making more vulnerable these populations through the types of deterrence first policies that we've been seeing. And unfortunately, the point David was making, I think, rings to how hard it is, but how necessary it is to stop this snowball effect of, okay, the optics at the border look alarming again, and there's political risk in changing strategies. So we're going to keep on with the same policies or deepen them. But that's, of course, what needs to be happening. And I won't say much more so we can get to the Q&A, of course, especially for our filmmakers who are here with us. But of course, from a policy perspective, just as the film physically took us on a journey from Central America through Mexico to the US, we could, of course, go on that same journey, perhaps do it backwards, talking about what changes do we need to see. We need to see changes in the US, at the US border, the end of Title 42, which is arbitrarily keeping the border closed to asylum seekers, the end of Remain in Mexico, which is putting up more obstacles and danger to people who are making asylum claims. And then also, as everyone has mentioned, the end to this undue pressure for other countries to serve essentially as buffers to migration rather than being partners in addressing that migration constructively. So what we need is to build paths, not walls. So I will leave it there for now.
Great, Stephanie, and you prompted my question I was going to ask everybody in terms of a regional approach to migration. So first we'll go to the question from the audience that I had. Actually, there's two from the public, and then I have one quick thing. And I know, David, you have to go by 4, so we'll actually start with you in reverse. But the questions are more, formerly men would leave their families for economic reasons, so traditional migration arriving at the US, maybe because of persecution or security as well. Nowadays, we see many more women and children coming who are often unaccompanied by their adults, guardians, parents. So what explains some of the reasons why you have this different wave of migration at the US-Mexico border or in the region? Another in Spanish, ¿qué responsabilidad ética, aparte del interés propio de detener migración hacia el norte, tiene los Estados Unidos en Centroamérica para asegurar paz, seguridad y un buen vivir? And I'll add a question to this as well, looking at kind of what Stephanie was saying about what needs to happen. Last week, and we've been hearing for a month now or so, last week, President Biden in his meeting with Colombian President Duque officially announced what we had all heard about, which is that they're hoping to reach some sort of regional agreement on migration that they want to sign at the Summit of the Americas, which will be held in Los Angeles in early June. It's a regional declaration on migration and protection. What would be some of the key elements that you would need to see in a declaration that was to really address these regional flows? So David, why don't we start with you just because of your time and then go through the rest of the participants.
Sure. Well, thinking about this last question about regional cooperation, one of the basic findings of researchers who have studied the relationship between development and migration is that with more development, you get more migration, at least in the short run, as more people are able to afford to migrate, as they're able to find ways to overcome the constraints of poverty in order to pave a way out to a more prosperous society. Now, in the long run, development can reduce levels of out-migration, and it doesn't have to be a situation of parity between a country of origin and a country of destination. There are many historical examples of countries where once they're about maybe wages are 4 to 1 higher in the destination, that migration stops and can even reverse. I don't recall off the top of my head what the wage differential is between countries in Central America and the US. It's certainly much higher than 4 to 1. So there might be good reasons to put money into development spending, but preventing migration in the short run is probably not one of them. In the long run, again, that could have some effects like that. I think that probably the most effective techniques would be to find concrete ways to encourage the rule of law. So much of the migration out of Central America is the result of corruption, of the fact that it is difficult to distinguish often between police and criminal activity, of the fact that women in particular who are being abused by their domestic partners and spouses are not able to go to the police and find effective relief. And this is not my area of expertise, but I have it on the authority of people who have studied these issues around the world, that there are programs that have been demonstrated to be effective in encouraging this kind of rule of law that creates a safer society. You know, I think one of the other problems is drug policy, that governments and societies in Central America and Mexico are paying a price that they cannot afford for the illegalization of drugs in the major markets in North America. Obviously, there's drug consumption in Central America and Mexico as well, but the rule of law is too weak in those societies. The economic weight of the drug trafficking organizations is too heavy for those societies to be able to bear that price of legalization. So, sorry, of illegalization. So I think that, you know, some more basic structural reforms around the rule of law in different areas might be as important or more important than shoveling money into development projects if the goal is to reduce out-migration from Central America.
Great, thank you. Sonja?
Yeah, I take the questions on what seems to be changes in migration, and also the point on the declaration. So starting with the first one on the differences between what appeared to be economic migration for a long time and the different makeup that we seem to be seeing nowadays, with more women and children being among the migrants, and the perception that perhaps the reasons for the migration have changed. I would say that precisely one of the reasons why we wanted to make this film is to show that perhaps things haven't changed as much as seems to be the case. So of course, when we compare this migration that we're seeing nowadays to migration that perhaps was occurring in the 90s, perhaps I can understand this perception that perhaps there was a greater level of economic migration, and that we saw more men leaving Central American countries. But I would say this actually, it's not so simple to disaggregate the reasons for migration. So I think it's difficult to argue that there was more economic migration in the past than there is nowadays. And also, I think perhaps we should go beyond the appearances when we look at the profiles of the migrants, if we want to understand what is happening. So even if in El Salvador, for example, it seems that nowadays more people are leaving because of gang violence, there's still an economic dimension to this, because many people struggle to find stable employment in Central America. So many people set up their own small business in order to survive, and many people get extorted by a gang. So there's not just an element of violence or the threat of violence, but people also in those cases find it difficult to make a living. So we find that in many cases when we speak to migrants, there are actually several reasons that contribute to migration. And also when we think about the profile of migrants, it is still very mixed, in the sense that when we interviewed migrants from Honduras, for example, there were many men who were leaving for economic reasons, especially from the countryside, whereas families, for example, were leaving cities more because they were fleeing gang violence. But even so, perhaps what is more striking is that nowadays we find not just more women and children, but entire families who are leaving their countries, and that, for me at least, is a sign that people no longer contemplate a future in their country. So if you want to think about the idea of economic migration and men leaving their country of origin, perhaps there is this hope still that they're going to Mexico or the United States to earn some money and then go back to their country of origin with the savings they were able to accumulate in another country. But when we have entire families leaving their country, I think there is a sense that people find it difficult to imagine a different future in their country. And this was especially striking when we spoke to Hondurans in a previous research project that actually was in part the basis for this documentary. People thought that the situation was so serious, especially when Juan Orlando Hernandez was still president, that people were not able to imagine a different life for themselves in their country of origin. And so at some point they decided that there was no way forward for them in their country, and the whole family decided to leave. But we also have to recognize that even if it's irregular migration, people still need a minimum amount of resources to be able to attempt this migration. So this is also perhaps why we are not seeing even more families than we do already, because people do need some resources to make this long journey. So just in a nutshell, I think we should go beyond these appearances, that we seem to be witnessing, and try to understand more why it is that that people are leaving their countries, and why they do it the way they do it. Very quickly on the declaration that is supposed to be signed. Again, I would invite people to go beyond that, since it's only a declaration. It is not binding. So this is, for me, this is just another another way of making political commitments that later on really have no greater significance. So it's easy for governments to sign these declarations and to make an appearance of commitment to really addressing migration, but then we see that governments are not really providing a coherent response. So when we think about this declaration, and more generally about the response to forced migration, the problem is not so much what governments declare they would like to do, but the problem is one of implementation. So we have really a series of stated commitments, but in practice we see many inconsistencies, really a lack of coherence, and this is even the case with the Biden administration. And just perhaps to give two brief examples, because the Biden administration has spoken, for example, about its interest to foster investment in Central America so that people will have more jobs. But then the question we might ask is, how valuable will this investment or this employment really be if the jobs are limited to more poorly paid jobs in transnational corporations? Yeah, this is why people are leaving Central America already, because they're not able to make a living with the jobs that are available. And the other example, something that I came across recently, is that the United States also dumps garbage in Central American locations, and so we know already that there is a problem of environmental degradation, and really Central American territories are becoming decreasingly livable. So really what I see as one of the problems is the rhetoric on the one hand that promises that forced migration will be addressed holistically, and on the other hand we see either inconsistent or fragmented responses, or simply a continuation of deterrence. So this is, in the case of this declaration, this is really for me just one more sign that governments are not really serious about addressing forced migration.
Thank you, Sonja. Maxime?
No, no tengo nada en particular que agregar. Me sumo a lo de Sonja, quien hizo toda la investigación, entonces yo soy más la cámara.
Bueno, ahorita te preguntamos algo sobre la filmación. Stephanie, no sé si tienes algún comentario.
I mean, just I think to reiterate some of what our panelists have already said, but to boil it down, what do we not want to see in regional migration agreements or cooperation? Certainly what we don't want to see, and what I would say is an untenable situation, is for one of the countries participating in and driving those discussions to have its border closed to asylum seekers, right? If we're talking about collaboration, then the minimum baseline should be each one of those countries recognizing, for instance, the right to seek asylum. What we don't want to see also is an agreement whose driving purpose, or one of the main purposes, is simply for other countries, not the United States, to be blocking or absorbing migration, and the idea that migrants arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border is somehow a failure. These scenarios simply don't make sense for a number of reasons. Certainly, when you look at the population in migration and in forced migration, there are people who, and I'm going to focus a little bit my comments on the situation in Mexico and the United States. That's the area that I know best because of my area of work in WOLA. But certainly there are migrants and asylum seekers who would settle in Mexico if they could obtain legal status or obtain asylum and find a safe place to be in Mexico. That may be a country that is a bit closer to home, certainly linguistically, maybe easier to incorporate into for any number of reasons, family ties. So Mexico can be a destination country. That's a role, in fact, is a role it is playing. There are people who can tell you that they do not feel safe in Mexico, and they may have very concrete reasons not to feel safe in Mexico. They may have family in the United States. They may be children whose parents are in the United States, or they may have their network of support awaiting them in the United States. Those people are not going to settle in Mexico. Their destination very clearly is a different country. These realities coexist, so we can't go to any extremes in terms of classifying the migrant population. We have to understand that the countries of the region are playing multiple roles, and they're called to play multiple roles in terms of giving protection and access to asylum, in terms of knowing there are going to be populations transiting into them or through them or settling in them. So that needs to be the logic. The logic of regional cooperation needs to be recognizing what does this population need to survive, which at its very basic level would be security and the possibility of a dignified existence. So, how can those paths be facilitated and distributed such that those needs are being met? Because that's the only actual way to avoid forced migration. All the deterrence in the world, at the end of the day, it does cause cyclical variations, for instance, in how many people are arriving at a certain border, but it does not actually address that flow of people. And I would just say quickly on the questions in the chat, I think these are bringing up some great points. Just to add quickly to what Sonja said on the different populations who are leaving, another important point to make is that to the extent that families in particular, or really anyone, people who are leaving because of threats and violent acts, sometimes precisely those people are leaving from one day to the next without having the opportunity to plan their journey, without having the opportunity to gather as many resources as they perhaps know that they're going to need, but they just cannot. And the people who set off in those circumstances are in a very acute situation of vulnerability. As we've been told constantly by migrants, everything costs money, every step, everything you need to do, it's going to mean paying somebody, paying a bribe, being extorted. And so people who lack those resources and were not able to plan the journey a bit more are in a very acute situation of vulnerability. And then I also think the last point is a great one, looking beyond the very practical need to just have a logical management of migration and asylum in the region. Of course, the United States is also not an indifferent neutral observer to some of these problems. As the film touches on, as you touched on, Maureen, the United States has also played a role in generating some of these circumstances. So certainly another very valuable message that I think comes through in the documentary.
Thank you. We have about 7-8 minutes. So I had a question for you, Maxime, on the production side of things. Dos preguntas más bien. Por un lado, cubrieron muchas partes de México, o sea, la frontera sur, luego Saltillo, Tijuana. O sea, ¿cómo decidieron dónde ir? Porque hay muchas otras partes donde no pudieron cubrir. Y segundo, a nivel de cómo firmaron, porque yo creo que lo me llama mucho la atención son imágenes desde arriba, visuales. Yo soy de Arizona, estudié en Tucson, o sea, soy nativa de Arizona, me encanta ver el desierto, que son estas montañas, o sea, cómo captaron todas esas imágenes. Y una pregunta para ti, Sonja, do it in English or Spanish, I'll do it in English quickly. I think on Honduras, I've heard the same thing from many Hondurans that I've talked to in Mexico, like the feeling of hopelessness, you know, that they had no belief that their government would come through for them in any way, and especially when Juan Orlando was president. They reelected Xiomara Castro in November of last year. You know, the National Party is out of office. How much do you think this gives Hondurans? Any sign of hope? And then just overall, I mean, where do you view migration from Central America? If you look at US apprehension numbers, Central American migration is down a little bit. I mean, it's not completely dropped, but there's other nationalities that are also increasingly reaching the US-Mexico border, Venezuelans, Cubans, others. So where do you see it, just looking at the Northern Triangle countries too, the migration flows and who might be still feeling like they're forced to leave their home countries?
Me permito entonces contestar primero. Bueno, sobre los lugares, porque efectivamente son muchos lugares, muchos más, ¿no? Que se hubieran podido grabar y aparecer en el documental. Para ser honesto, es principalmente un tema de dinero, que no se pudo explorar más espacios, o también de tiempo, ¿no? Porque había que más o menos cerrar el documental y su grabación entre septiembre y la primera mitad de octubre, y eso hizo que tuvimos que recortar el viaje, ¿no? Yo recuerdo que en una fase muy inicial del documental habíamos pensado ir a otros lugares, como también en Tamaulipas, donde había esta otra frontera, ¿no? que presenta también mucho interés. Y también hay que recordar que en el momento de la grabación, es decir, como más o menos el mes de septiembre, el contexto migratorio era muy específico, ¿no? En torno a las caravanas compuestas mayormente por personas haitianas que atravesaron Chiapas y más tarde que llegaron a la frontera de Ciudad Acuña del Río, ¿no? Habíamos pensado ir en estos momentos, honestamente fue por razones financieras que no pudimos acudir a estos lugares que hubieran sido muy interesantes documentar. Entonces nos focalizamos más o menos sobre 4 espacios en México, ¿no? Que es la frontera sur. Ahí sí pudimos cubrir 2 partes de la frontera sur que son bien distintos, ¿no? La frontera de Tenosique y la frontera de Tapachula. Realmente Tenosique tuvimos menos de un día en el lugar, por eso aparecen muy pocas imágenes de fuera del albergue, ¿no? De la ciudad o de la frontera en sí. Eso me permite introducir el tema del tiempo, ¿no? Fue un documental muy, casi estuvimos corriendo, ¿no? Para hacer este documental, porque la grabación tomó 36 días en total, para pues 5 países, más de 17 lugares de grabación. Literalmente teníamos muy muy poco tiempo en cada lugar, quizá menos de 2 días en general por lugar de grabación, salvo en Tapachula, donde tuvimos un poco más de tiempo, también Aguascalientes. Pero realmente era una cuestión de tiempo, ¿no? Y teníamos las entrevistas ya planeadas, entonces íbamos casi de la central de camión a hacer la entrevista, a grabar un poco en la ciudad y teníamos que ir, ¿no? Lo que nos dejaba como muy poco margen para adaptarnos a las coyunturas, ¿no? Que pasaban. Por ejemplo, estábamos en Tapachula cuando sucedían lo de las caravanas de haitianos en Huistla, un poco más, que ya casi llegaban hacia Arriaga, ¿no? En Chiapas, ¿no? En la frontera sur de México, y no nos daba el tiempo de ir a grabar esos lugares porque ya teníamos planeado el viaje a Tenosique. Entonces, por mucho que queríamos adaptarnos a las coyunturas, ¿no? A los eventos que sucedían alrededor de nosotros, dependíamos mucho del tiempo y del dinero, que es un desafío en cada documental, ¿no? Y sobre las técnicas, pues éramos 3 en grabar, bueno, siempre yo y luego mis compañeros César Ortiz López y Alberto Villaescusa, que me apoyaron cada uno, bueno, César me apoyó en la parte de Centroamérica y en México, y Alberto me acompañó en Arizona y en California para grabar. Traíamos siempre 2 cámaras, ¿no? Para grabar a doble ángulo, es decir, que las entrevistas, la mayoría de las entrevistas que pueden ver son grabadas a 2 ángulos. También por eso pueden ver, por ejemplo, en la escena del río Suchiate, entre Guatemala y México, pueden ver a la vez alguien que graba en la lancha y alguien que graba con el dron, la lancha donde me encuentro, porque traíamos un dron, ¿no? Entonces hicimos como varias giras donde yo o César estábamos en la lancha y la otra persona libre pues estaba manejando el dron, y así nos permitía como grabar la misma lancha, pero desde una perspectiva más interna, ¿no? Yo en la lancha como si estuviera llegando con los migrantes del lado mexicano, y mi compañero César que estaba con el dron grabándome, ¿no? Mientras estábamos así. La mayoría del tiempo estuvimos así a 2 cámaras a doble ángulo para cubrir más superficie. Y realmente pues es eso, ¿no? Para introducir cada lugar intentamos grabar con el dron en cada lugar cuando llegamos. A veces no fue posible por temas de batería, como es el caso en Saltillo, yo creo que tampoco en Aguascalientes, o hay otro lugar en el documental que no aparece con dron porque teníamos que trasladarnos en camión de un lugar para otro, no teníamos el tiempo para recargar baterías, y bueno, otra vez el tema del tiempo, ¿no? Y del dinero. Fue una experiencia muy gratificante, muy interesante de grabar es la primera vez que la verdad grabo tantas personas, tantos lugares, tanta información en tan poco tiempo. Fue muy interesante, sobre todo de pasar mientras sucedía lo de las caravanas, ¿no? Yo vuelvo siempre a eso de las caravanas porque era el contexto muy particular en el cual nos encontrábamos al momento de grabar. Era muy interesante de pasar en poco más de 30 días desde
I think we have lost Maxime for a minute. While we figure out if his connection gets better, Sonja, perhaps last words from you. We're wrapping up.
Sure. So I'll respond to your question about Honduras and the future of Central American migration. I can see that Hondurans feel there is some hope now with the change of president. Personally, I feel more skeptical about the possibility of change, and I think we can also perhaps compare this a little to what was being attempted in Guatemala, in the sense that many of the efforts there were aimed at very high profile corruption cases, the figure of Otto Pérez Molina, for example. But I think the experience of Guatemala also serves as a caution for Honduras, in the sense that it would be simplistic to expect change simply by removing certain high-profile figures. So in the case of Honduras, the former president Juan Orlando Hernandez has been arrested. And former senior police officer also who collaborated with him. But I think it would be premature to conclude from this that things are necessarily going to improve in Honduras, and that is because the criminal structures that have existed, and also the corruption networks, really go very, very deep, are very far-reaching, and eliminating those networks or those structures would take a long time. So I feel skeptical about that possibility. Generally, if we look at the Northern Triangle of Central America, I would, as a general trend, forced migration to continue. Certainly from Honduras. El Salvador perhaps is a trickier case, again, because Bukele is also a figure that that inspired hope among people who were disillusioned with the main political parties. But we've also seen in El Salvador that things can change very quickly. So there may be rhetoric that inspires hope among voters, but then the policies that are implemented by supposedly progressive political leaders can change very quickly, and this is also something we've seen in Mexico. So I would expect forced migration to continue from the three countries. The question is, how can we perhaps keep track of what is happening? And I say this because people continue to find different ways of traveling, and people don't necessarily stay in migrant shelters, for example, where we can speak to them and ask them about their reasons for forced migration. So something that struck me, for example, when I did this research on forced migration, was that there were many Hondurans in the migrant shelters, but less so Salvadorans and certainly Guatemalans. And so when we think about how people attempt this migration, it's not just a question of are they going to take a train, or are they going to travel in a trailer, but also smugglers. To what extent do people rely on smugglers if they can obtain the resources for this? And so I think many forced migrants will go undetected in some ways, because they're not they don't appear to us in locations where we can speak to them.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I see a few quick comments in the Q&A, so if the participants can take a look at them, maybe follow up later. We did repost the YouTube link there for those of you that would like to see it again, and it will be, as Sonja mentioned, a microsite will be launched, so we'll be happy to promote that when it's out. I wanted to thank the interpreters for their support today, and certainly thank Sonja and Maxime for all of their work on this great documentary. It's great to see it. I love the footage and the music, and Stephanie and David also for their perspective based on their work and research. So thank you all for joining us today, and hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.